If you walk through the financial district of London today, you will see a fortress. It is a massive building with windowless walls that look like the side of a cliff. It occupies an entire city block. It is guarded by men in pink tailcoats and top hats. It is known as the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street. It is the Bank of England. When we look at this building, we feel a sense of permanence. We feel that it has always been there. We feel that it is the bedrock of stability. We imagine that it was founded by prudent men, men with white hair and gold pocket watches, men who believed in saving and thrift and caution. But this is an illusion. The truth is that the Bank of England was not born out of stability. It was born out of desperation. It was not founded by a saint. It was founded by a sinner. And it was not created to save money. It was created to print it out of thin air. The story of the birth of central banking is not a story of economics. It is a story of war. It is a story of revolution. And at the center of it is a man named William Paterson, a man who was part visionary, part hustler, and part pirate. To understand how our modern world of debt began, we have to go back to the year 1694. London in 1694 was not a place of order. It was a city of mud and smoke and noise. It was a city recovering from the Great Fire and the Great Plague. It was a city teeming with merchants and thieves and spies. But above all, it was a city that was broke. The King of England was William III. He was a Dutchman who had come to the throne in the Glorious Revolution a few years earlier. He was a cold and serious man. He had one obsession in life. He wanted to destroy King Louis XIV of France. Louis XIV was the Sun King. He was the most powerful monarch in Europe. He lived in the splendor of Versailles. He had the largest army and the largest navy, and he wanted to dominate the world. William III was determined to stop him. He dragged England into a massive conflict known as the 9 Years' War. It was a war that spanned the continent. There were battles in Flanders, there were battles in Ireland, there were battles on the high seas, but war is expensive. In the 17th century, war was becoming industrial. It required thousands of cannons. It required tons of gunpowder. It required fleets of ships of the line. And it required an army of 50,000 men who needed to be fed and clothed and paid every single day. England did not have the money. The English treasury was empty. The tax system was medieval. The king tried to tax windows. He tried to tax salt. He tried to tax land. But it was never enough. The soldiers were going unpaid. The suppliers were refusing to send food. The ships were rotting in the harbor. The situation was critical. In 1690, the French Navy had defeated the English and Dutch fleets at the Battle of Beachy Head. For a moment, it looked like the French might invade England. There was panic in the streets of London. King William needed gold, and he needed it now. He went to the city of London. The city was the square mile where the merchants and the goldsmiths lived. These were the rich men of the kingdom. In the past, when a king needed money, he would go to the goldsmiths and ask for a loan. The goldsmiths would lend him gold coins, and the king would promise to pay them back with taxes later. But the goldsmiths were tired of kings. They knew that kings were bad debtors. King Charles II. The uncle of the current king had famously defaulted on his debts in 1672. He had simply refused to pay the goldsmiths back. He called it the stop of the exchequer. It ruined many banking families. So when William came asking for money, the goldsmiths crossed their arms. They demanded interest rates of 20% or 30%. They demanded collateral. They treated the King of England like a beggar. The government tried to issue debt using wooden sticks. And these were called tally sticks. They were pieces of willow wood with notches carved into them to represent the amount of money owed. The stick was split in half. The government kept one half, and the creditor kept the other. It was a primitive system. You cannot fight a modern war with wooden sticks. The government was desperate. They were losing the war because they could not pay the bills. They needed a miracle. And that is when William Paterson walked into the room. William Paterson is one of the most mysterious figures in financial history. He was born in Scotland in 1658. He came from a humble background, but he was a man of immense ambition and restless energy. As a young man, he left Scotland and went to the Americas. He spent years in the Caribbean. He lived in the Bahamas and Jamaica. What he did there is a subject of debate. He claimed he was a merchant and a preacher, but the rumors in London said something else. The rumors said he was a buccaneer, a pirate. The Caribbean in the 1680s was the golden age of piracy. It was a place where men made fortunes overnight by seizing Spanish galleons. It was a place where the laws of Europe did not apply. Patterson certainly had the mind of a pirate. He understood risk. He understood leverage. He understood that if you want to win big, you have to bet big. When he returned to London, he was a wealthy man. He wore fine clothes. He spoke fast. He had 1,000 ideas. He was what we would today call a promoter, a man who could sell ice to Eskimos. He looked at the situation of King William, and he saw an opportunity. He saw that the old way of borrowing money was broken. The goldsmiths were too small. Their vaults were too limited. Patterson had seen something in his travels. He had been to Amsterdam. He had seen the Bank of Amsterdam. He knew that the Dutch were able to borrow money much cheaper than the English because they had a public bank. But Patterson wanted to go one step further than the Dutch. He came up with a plan that was so radical that most people thought he was insane. He proposed to create a private company, a company of merchants. This company would raise £1,200,000 in gold from private investors. This was a colossal sum of money. It was more than the king could raise in a year of taxes. The company would then lend this entire pile of gold to the king, all of it. In exchange, the king would pay the company 8% interest per year. So far, this sounds like a normal loan, a very large loan, but still a loan. But here's the twist. Here's the magic trick that Patterson invented. He asked the king to give the company a royal charter, and in this charter he asked for a special privilege. He asked for the right to issue paper notes to the value of the loan. Let me explain what this means, because it is the secret of modern money. Patterson was saying that even though the company had lent its gold to the king, and the gold was gone, spent on gunpowder and ships, the company could still act as if it had the money. They could print pieces of paper that said, "Promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £1." And because these notes were backed by the government debt, people would trust them. They would use them as money. This meant that the company could lend the money twice. They lent the gold to the king, and then they lent the paper notes to the public. They would earn interest from the king. They would earn interest from the public. It was alchemy. It was creating money out of nothing. Patterson called it the fund of credit. He famously said, "The bank hath benefit of interest on all monies which it creates out of nothing." Today, we call this fractional reserve banking. We call it fiat currency. But in 1694, it was revolutionary. And to many people, it was terrifying. The establishment hated the idea. The Tories, the conservative landowners, hated it because they thought it would give too much power to the merchants. They thought that money should be based on land and gold, not on paper promises. The goldsmiths hated it because it would put them out of business. They warned that this new bank would become a monster. They said it would buy up all the land in England. They said it would enslave the king to a group of anonymous bankers. But King William did not care about philosophy. He cared about winning the war. He looked at Patterson's plan and he saw only one thing: £1,200,000. He saw a fleet of new ships. He saw paid soldiers. He saw the defeat of France, so he gave the green light. The government passed the Tonnage Act of 1694. It was called the Tonnage Act because it included new taxes on the tonnage of ships to pay the interest on the loan. Hidden inside this tax bill was the charter for the governor and company of the Bank of England. Now, Patterson had to prove that his idea would work. He had to raise the money. The subscription books were opened on June 21st, 1694. The location was the Mercer's Hall in Cheapside. Patterson and his associates were nervous. Would the people of London trust this new invention? Would they hand over their gold for a piece of paper and a promise? The response was electric. It was the first great financial mania of London. The merchants, the lawyers, the widows, the aristocrats, they all lined up to buy shares in the bank. The king and queen were the first to subscribe. They put down £10,000. This gave the project the royal seal of approval. The entire sum of £1,200,000 was raised in just 11 days. It was a miracle. The money poured in. The clerks could barely count the coins fast enough. Patterson was triumphant. He had done the impossible. He had capitalized the war effort in less than 2 weeks. The gold was immediately carted off to the exchequer. It was loaded onto wagons and sent to the army in Flanders. Almost overnight, the tide of the war began to turn. The English soldiers were paid. The suppliers were paid. The navy was refitted. King Louis XIV in Versailles was shocked. He could not understand where this little island was getting so much money. He was the richest king in Europe, but his treasury was running dry. He was taxing his peasants to starvation. But England had found a way to tap into the future. They were fighting the war on credit. William Paterson became a director of the new bank. He was the man of the hour. He walked the streets of London like a conqueror. But, as is often the case with visionaries, Patterson was better at starting things than running them. The new Bank of England set up shop in the grocer's hall. They hired 17 clerks and a gatekeeper. They began to issue the first banknotes. These were not like the 20-pound notes you have in your wallet today. They were large, handwritten notes. They were signed by the cashier. They were often for odd amounts like £55 and 6 shillings. But they worked. The merchants accepted them. The trade of London began to flow more smoothly. However, Patterson was not satisfied. He was a man who needed action. He found the daily business of banking boring. Sitting in meetings discussing interest rates was not for him. He began to clash with the other directors. The other directors were sober, serious men. They were Huguenot merchants and Whig politicians. They wanted to run the bank carefully. Patterson wanted to gamble. He wanted to use the bank's money to fund other schemes. He proposed a fund for the orphans of London, which sounded charitable, but was actually a high-risk investment vehicle. The other directors were horrified. They realized that having a former pirate on the board of the central bank was a liability. Within a year of founding the bank, William Paterson was pushed out. He was forced to resign. He sold his stock and walked away from the institution he had created. It is one of the great ironies of history. The father of the Bank of England was fired by his own child before it could even walk. But Patterson did not disappear. He went back to his old dreaming. He came up with an even bigger idea, an idea that would eventually destroy the economy of his homeland, Scotland. He came up with the Darien scheme. But that is a tragedy for another story. Back in London, the Bank of England was facing its first fight for survival. The year was 1696. The bank was only 2 years old, and it was about to face a perfect storm. The problem was the silver coin. For centuries, the currency of England had been the silver penny and the silver shilling. But there was a flaw in the design of the coins. They had smooth edges. This meant that thieves could clip the edges. They would take a pair of shears and clip a tiny ring of silver off the outside of the coin. Then they would file it down to make it look round again. They would keep the clippings and melt them down into bullion. They would spend the clipped coin at its face value. Over decades, this practice had destroyed the currency. By 1695, the average shilling in circulation had lost half its weight. It was a thin, misshapen disc of metal. People were losing faith in the coin. Shopkeepers refused to accept them. There were riots in the markets. The government decided that they had to fix it. They decided to recall all the old coins and mint new ones. New coins with milled edges that could not be clipped. This was the Great Recoinage. It was a noble idea, but the execution was a disaster. The government demonetized the old coins before they had minted enough new ones. Suddenly, there was no silver in London. The cash disappeared. People panicked. They ran to the banks to withdraw their deposits. They wanted their money. But remember the secret of the Bank of England. They had lent the money to the king, and the gold was gone. They only had paper. On May 6th, 1696, the run on the bank began. A mob of angry citizens gathered outside the grocer's hall. They waved their banknotes and demanded gold. The directors of the bank were terrified. They looked into their vaults. They did not have enough coin to pay everyone. If they failed, the bank would collapse. The king's war funding would collapse. The French would win. The directors made a desperate decision. They partially suspended payments. They told the people they could only pay 10% of the value of the notes in cash. For the rest, they issued IOUs. It was a default in all but name. The enemies of the bank cheered. The goldsmiths who had been sidelined were delighted. They hoped this arrogant new company would die. But the bank had powerful friends. The government knew they could not let the bank fail. The Chancellor of the Exchequer intervened. He ordered the tax collectors to accept Bank of England notes for tax payments. This was the masterstroke. By making the notes valid for taxes, the government forced people to use them. It created a demand for the paper. If you needed to pay your taxes, you needed a banknote. Therefore, the note had value. This established a principle that holds true to this day. The value of a currency comes from the fact that the government demands it for taxes. The bank survived the crisis of 1696, but it was a close call. It was during this crisis that another famous figure entered the story, Isaac Newton. Yes, the man who discovered gravity. In 1696, Newton moved from Cambridge to London to become the warden of the Royal Mint. His job was to oversee the production of the new silver coins. He was the man responsible for solving the shortage of cash. Newton took the job seriously. He became a detective. He hunted down the counterfeiters and the clippers. He interrogated them in the Tower of London. He sent men to the gallows. Newton understood that for the new financial system to work, there had to be trust. The paper of the bank and the silver of the mint had to be beyond suspicion. While Newton was fixing the coins, the Bank of England was fixing its political power. They realized that their survival depended on being useful to the state. They became the government's banker. They managed the national debt. Every time the king needed money for a new war, and there were many wars in the 18th century, he came to the bank. The bank would print more notes, the army would get more supplies, the British Empire would expand. It was a symbiotic relationship. The bank funded the empire, and the empire protected the bank. By the 1700s, the Bank of England had moved to its permanent home on Threadneedle Street. It built the fortress walls. It hired the guards. It became the symbol of British power. But the pirate spirit of William Paterson was never fully exercised. The bank was still a private company. It was owned by shareholders. Its primary goal was profit, and this tension between private profit and public duty would lead to the next great catastrophe, the South Sea Bubble. The South Sea Company was a rival to the Bank of England. It was created in 1711. It tried to copy Patterson's model. It took over the government debt in exchange for a monopoly on trade with South America. The Bank of England hated the South Sea Company. They fought a bitter war for control of the government's finances. In 1720, the South Sea Company stock went parabolic. It was a mania that gripped the entire nation. The price went from £100 to £1,000 in months. The Bank of England was tempted to join the madness. They almost merged with the South Sea Company. If they had done so, the bank would have collapsed when the bubble burst. But at the last minute, the bank pulled out. They stayed on the sidelines. When the crash came in late 1720, it wiped out the fortunes of thousands of people. It bankrupted aristocrats and scientists, including Isaac Newton himself. The South Sea Company was disgraced, but the Bank of England was left standing. Because they had survived the crash, they were seen as the only safe harbor. They became the lender of last resort. This is when the bank truly became a central bank. It wasn't just a bank for the government, it became the bank for other banks. When other banks got into trouble, they came to Threadneedle Street for a bailout. The system that William Paterson invented in a coffee shop in 1694 had become the operating system of the British Empire. It allowed Britain, a small island nation, to punch well above its weight. It allowed Britain to outspend France in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon famously called Britain a nation of shopkeepers. He meant it as an insult. But he didn't understand the power of the shopkeeper's bank. While Napoleon had to loot the countries he conquered to pay his troops, Britain could just issue a new bond. Britain could mobilize the wealth of the future to fight the battles of the present. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, it was British gold and British debt that defeated the French emperor. William Paterson died in 1719. He died in poverty. His great schemes had mostly failed. The Darien colony was a disaster. He was largely forgotten. But his invention conquered the world. Other nations looked at the success of Britain, and they realized they needed a central bank too. Napoleon founded the Bank of France in 1800 to copy the English model. Germany founded the Reichsbank. Japan founded the Bank of Japan. And finally, after a century of resistance, even the United States capitulated. For a long time, America resisted the idea of a central bank. They remembered the warnings of the founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, who said that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. But in 1913, a group of bankers met in secret on Jekyll Island. They drafted the plan for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the direct descendant of the Bank of England. It operates on the same principle. It is a partnership between private banks and the government. It creates money out of debt. When you look at a dollar bill today or a pound note, you are looking at a debt instrument. You are looking at a piece of paper that represents a promise, and that promise began with a pirate. It is a strange legacy. William Paterson was a man who lived on the edge of the law. He was a speculator, a risk-taker, and yet he built the most conservative institution in the world. But perhaps it is not so strange. Perhaps it takes a pirate to understand the true nature of money. Patterson understood that money is not gold. Gold is just a metal. It is heavy. It is hard to move. It is limited. Patterson understood that real money is trust. It is belief. It is the belief that the state will survive, the belief that the economy will grow, the belief that tomorrow will be better than today. By turning that belief into paper, Patterson unlocked the engine of modern capitalism. But he also unlocked a monster. He created a system where debt is essential. In the system of the Bank of England, if all the debts were paid off, there would be no money left. The money is the debt. This is why the national debt of Britain and America never goes down. It only goes up. It has to go up. To print more money, you have to issue more debt. It is a treadmill that we can never get off. We are still living in William Paterson's world. A world where we finance our wars and our welfare states and our highways on the promise of the future. We are borrowing from our grandchildren just as King William borrowed from the future tax revenues of England. Some people say this is a house of cards. They say that eventually the confidence will break. They say that one day the people will show up at the bank and demand something real and there will be nothing there. They might be right. But for 330 years, the house that Patterson built has stood firm. It survived the recoinage. It survived the South Sea bubble. It survived Napoleon. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the Great Depression. The Bank of England still stands on Threadneedle Street. It is a little bigger now. The walls are thicker. But the heart of the machine is the same. It is a machine that turns the ambition of a nation into currency. So the next time you use a credit card or take out a mortgage or look at the national debt clock, spare a thought for William Paterson, the Scotsman who walked into the city of London with a pirate as swagger and sold the king a dream. The dream that you can have everything you want today if you just promise to pay for it forever. To truly understand the machine that William Paterson built, we have to look at what it destroyed. We have to look at the system that came before it. For hundreds of years before the Bank of England, the financial heart of the British government was not a bank vault. It was a piece of wood. It was called the tally stick. These were willow sticks, about 8 inches long. When the king borrowed money or collected taxes, the clerks at the exchequer would take a stick and carve notches into it. The width of the notch indicated the amount of money. A thick notch was 1,000 pounds. A thin scratch was a penny. Once the notches were carved, the stick was split down the middle. One half was given to the creditor, and the other half was kept by the government. When it was time to pay, the 2 halves were matched together. If the grain of the wood matched, the debt was real. It was a primitive system. It was clumsy. It was physical. But it was honest. You could not print more wood. You could not inflate the value of a stick. A stick was a stick. But the new system of the Bank of England was different. It was abstract. It relied on paper and ink and faith. When the Bank of England rose to power, the tally sticks became obsolete. They piled up in the basements of the government buildings. By the 19th century, there were millions of them. They were rotting. They were taking up space. In 1834, the government decided to get rid of them. They were the relics of an old world, a world before central banking. So they ordered the workmen to burn them. The workmen threw the sticks into the furnaces beneath the House of Lords. But the wood was old and dry. It burned too hot. The fire raged out of control. It spread to the paneling. It spread to the roof. On the night of October 16, 1834, the British Parliament burned to the ground. It is a powerful symbol. The old money system literally destroyed the seat of government. It made way for the new system, the system of debt, the system of the bank. But this transition was not just about wood versus paper. It was a philosophical war, and the general on the other side of the battlefield was Isaac Newton. We touched on Newton earlier, but his role in this story is often overlooked. We think of him as a scientist staring at the stars. But for 30 years, he was the warden and then the master of the Royal Mint. Newton was the guardian of hard money. He believed that money had to be tangible. It had to be gold or silver. He believed that the value of money came from the metal itself, not from the promise of a government. While the Bank of England was printing paper notes, Newton was obsessed with the purity of the coin. He calculated the exact weight of gold to the decimal point. He chased down counterfeiters with the same intensity that he chased down the laws of physics. His greatest enemy was a man named William Challoner. Challoner was a master criminal, a counterfeiter who had grown rich by flooding London with fake coins. Challoner mocked Newton. He thought he could outsmart the professor. But Newton was relentless. He built a network of spies in the London underworld. He went undercover to bars and taverns. He gathered evidence. He systematically dismantled Challoner's operation. In 1699, thanks to Newton's work, William Challoner was hanged at Tyburn. This was the conflict of the age. On one side, you had the Bank of England founded by a pirate pushing for paper money and credit. On the other side, you had the Royal Mint, run by a scientist pushing for gold and strict standards. For 200 years, these two systems existed in tension. The paper and the gold, the bank and the mint. Britain operated on what was called the gold standard. The Bank of England could print notes, but they had to be backed by gold in the vault. If you walked into the bank with a £5 note, they were legally required to give you £5 of gold. This kept the system honest. It put a leash on the pirate's invention. The bank could not just print money forever, because eventually they would run out of gold. But in the 20th century, the leash was cut. The First World War was the turning point. The cost of the war was so high that the governments of Europe could not pay for it with gold. They had to print more money than they had metal. They suspended the gold standard. They unleashed the printing press. And once the war was over, they found it hard to go back. They had tasted the power of unlimited money. In 1931, Britain officially abandoned the gold standard. In 1933, under Franklin Roosevelt, the United States confiscated gold from its citizens. In 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window forever. Today, there's no gold backing the currency. The tension is over. The pirate won. We now live entirely in William Paterson's world. The money in your bank account is not backed by anything physical. It is backed by debt. It is backed by the promise that the government will tax future generations to pay for it. So what are the consequences of this victory? The first consequence is inflation. When William Paterson founded the Bank of England, £1 could buy you a decent living. Today, £1 buys you almost nothing. Since 1694, the British pound has lost over 99% of its purchasing power. This is not an accident. This is a feature of the system. When the central bank creates new money, it dilutes the value of the money that already exists. It is like pouring water into wine. If you have a savings account, you are the one drinking the watered-down wine. Economists call this the inflation tax. It is a tax that no one voted for. It is a tax that is never announced in a budget speech. But it is a tax that takes a little bit of your wealth every single year. It is the price we pay for the system of credit. The second consequence is the cycle of boom and bust. William Paterson was a speculator. He loved the gamble, and the system he created encourages gambling. By making credit cheap and easy, the central bank encourages people to borrow. It encourages businesses to expand. It creates booms. We saw this in the South Sea bubble. We saw it in the Roaring '20s. We saw it in the dot-com bubble. We saw it in the housing bubble of 2008. During the boom, everyone feels rich. The stock market goes up. House prices go up. But eventually the debt gets too big. The payments cannot be made. And then comes the crash. In the old days, before the central bank, a crash would wipe out the bad debts. It was painful, but it cleaned the system. But in the world of the central bank, the crash is not allowed to happen. When the crisis hits, the bank steps in. It prints more money. It bails out the failed banks. It lowers interest rates. It kicks the can down the road. This is exactly what the Bank of England did in 2008. And it is what the Federal Reserve did. They flooded the world with trillions of dollars of new money to stop the collapse. They saved the system, but they did not fix the problem. They just made the debt pile bigger. William Paterson would have recognized this tactic. It is the same tactic he used in 1694. When in doubt, leverage up. When in doubt, bet on the future. But there is a darker side to Patterson's legacy. The Bank of England was created to fund a war. And for 300 years, central banks have been the best friends of the military-industrial complex. Before central banking, kings had to think twice before starting a war. War meant raising taxes, which made the peasants angry. It meant borrowing gold, which was expensive. But with a central bank, a government can fight a war without raising taxes immediately. They can pay for the bombs with printed money and let the inflation pay the bill later. It makes war easier. It makes war longer. Some historians argue that the First World War would have ended in 1915 if the gold standard had been strictly enforced. The nations ran out of money, but because they could print fiat currency, they could keep the slaughter going for 3 more years. Millions of men died in the trenches because the printing presses kept running. This is the heavy burden of the pirates' invention. It unleashed the economy, but it also unleashed the state. So who was William Paterson really? Was he a hero? A genius who unlocked the potential of capital and allowed the West to rise to prosperity? Or was he a villain? A swindler who trapped the world in a web of debt and inflation? The truth is probably both. He was a man of his time, a time of exploration and piracy and scientific revolution. He looked at the static world of gold and wood, and he saw a dynamic world of paper and credit. He died poor and forgotten. His name is not on the front of the Bank of England. There are no statues of him in the financial district. But his spirit is everywhere. Every time you tap your card to buy a coffee, you are using his system. Every time a government passes a deficit budget, they are using his system. Every time the stock market rallies on the news of a rate cut, they are dancing to his tune. We are all sailors on William Paterson's ship. It is a ship made of paper, floating on an ocean of debt. It has sailed for 3 centuries through storms and hurricanes. It has made us richer than any generation in history. But the hull is leaking. The debt is rising. And the gold is gone. Some people say that the age of the central bank is coming to an end. They look at Bitcoin. They look at the return of gold buying by nations like China and Russia. They say that the math finally does not add up. They say that you cannot print prosperity forever. If they are right, then we are heading for a reckoning. A reckoning that will make the South Sea bubble look like a picnic. But if Patterson were alive today, he would probably just smile. He would probably tell us to double down. He would tell us to launch a new scheme, a new fund, a new currency. Because for a pirate, the next prize is always just over the horizon. The Bank of England started with a loan of £1,200,000. Today, the global debt is over $300 trillion. It is the biggest gamble in the history of the universe. And the wheel is still spinning.